Hi, welcome back to Educator.com's AP Music Theory course. Today's lesson is part writing seventh chords. So the objectives for this lesson are we're going to integrate seventh chords into our part writing exercises, which have up till now we've started with root position chords and then looked at first inversion and 6/4 or second inversion chords. And we're going to look at diatonic seventh chords, and then the 5/7 as kind of a separate entity with some different idioms. And then we're going to look at some familiar seventh chord patterns, like seventh chords in sequence. So this is a familiar idea, this preparing and resolving the seventh from the lesson on non-chord tones and suspensions. So when sevenths appear in part writing, they should be treated the same way as seventh, sixth suspensions. So we need to make sure that the seventh is prepared and then introduced and resolved downwards. And the difference between this and a suspension is that it doesn't have to happen in the same chord. So you can have a seventh moving to a sixth or not a sixth, but down a step to a consonant in the following chord. And that'll make more sense when we look at this right now. So let's take some chords here. So let's say we're in C, and we're starting with C major, of course, E, G, C, and then we're going to let's move to a 2 chord. So we're moving up by step, and what we want to do is we need to know what is the seventh of a 2 chord, and of course a seventh above D is C. So here we have this consonant C that's going to form the seventh in the 2 chord, so that must be tied over. And then we just need to fill in the rest of the chord. And in this case, we have to be careful of parallels, so we'll move the G down to an F and the E down to a D. And you'll notice here that we don't have a complete chord. We're missing the fifth, which is okay in seventh, when you have a seventh chord, because of avoiding parallels and different considerations. So now we have this seventh here, which has been prepared. Consonant doesn't have to be tied over. And now we want to make sure that in the next chord it moves down to a B, and a B that is consonant. So let's do a B here, and let's move this to a 5. So the D is going to move to a G, and then let's say this D stays on D, and this F moves up to G. And now we have a complete chord again with good doubling. So the seventh was prepared here and resolved here. Let's do one more example of that. Let's do it in a minor key this time. What about A minor? And let's start on a tonic harmony. So let's see, A, and then A, C, E. And now let's move this to a 4 chord. Or not a 4 chord, a 2 chord. 2 diminished 6, so 4 in the bass. And now let's say we want, so of course this is going to be a 6/5 since we're dealing with 7th chords. So the first thing we have to do is know what note the 7th is. So in this case, it's not going to be a 7th above the bass because the bass is not the root of the chord. So the root of this chord, 2 diminished, is B. So 7th above that is A. So here's our A here. So of course we're going to make sure that that stays in the same voice. And now we know that we're missing a B, a D. We have a D and an A, so we're missing a B and an F. So we'll move this C down to B here. And we'll move this E up to F here. And then we need to complete this motion of the 7th by making sure it resolves down a step here. So we'll take this down to G, and let's move this to a 5 chord as well, which means that it's a dominant chord, and this actually needs to be a G sharp, which is perfectly fine for a resolution because it just needs to be consonant with the bass. So there's the G sharp, and then we can keep the common tone B, and then this F moves down a step to A. So again, we've got the preparation, and then here's the 7th, and here's the resolution. And so here, this ends up being a 2, 6, 5, and up here I should have written 2, 7. So now let's look at 5, 7 and some of its inversions. So the difference between 5, 7 and dealing with other 7th chords is that the dominant 7th can appear without any preparation. So doesn't require preparation. So for instance, we can move, if we're in C major and we have a C major chord here, we can move right to a 5, 7 and not worry about, so which note is the 7th in C? It would be an F above the G chord. So we can move right to the 7th without worrying about having an F in the previous chord. So in this case, the E is moving up a half step to F, but the resolution is, of course, very important. So the dominant chord, again, resolving back to 1, which means we keep the common tone and move the leading tone to C and resolve the 7th down to E. So resolution. Let's look at, and we saw an example of a 6-5 chord in the previous example. So let's look at one special case with 5, which is 5-4-2. So let's say we have a bass line like this in C major, C, G, F, E. So how can we think about harmonizing this bass line? So if we have a 1 here, obviously, on C, and then a 5 on G, and this G moves down to an F, we know immediately that this F can't be a 4 chord or any kind of subdominant harmony like a 2-6, because 5 cannot move, the dominant can't move to a subdominant chord. So the way to harmonize this bass line is to make this a 5-4-2, which is, of course, the third inversion 7th chord, which means the 7th is in the bass. And so let's work that out up to there. So C, G, C, E, moving to a 5 chord here. And so for this chord, we need the 7th plus the dominant chord. So we've got the 7th in the bass, which means we can simply repeat the upper voices on G, B, D, and we've got the complete 7th chord. And now we need to think about where this chord is going to resolve to. So of course it's 5, so we can think about tonic harmony. And we need to make sure that the F resolves down a step to E, which it's doing in the bass, which means we can make this a 1-6 chord and say that it's the third of the tonic in the bass, and then resolve the dominant chord above it the way we normally would. And just so happens that the soprano is doubled, which is a nice doubling for this 1-6. So this pattern of moving from the 5th scale degree down to the 4th and down to the 3rd in any key is always an indication of this 5-4-2 bass line. This is a really important thing to remember when you're harmonizing bass lines. It's very tempting sometimes to look at this and write 5-4 here, but in terms of harmonic progression, it doesn't make sense the way this does. Okay, now let's look at some 7th chords in sequence. So let's give ourselves some room over here and start with just a one chord. So C, G, C, E. And now we want to make a sequence of chords moving roots by fifth and include seventh chords in that. So let's move this up to a 4 chord. So now we're on an F major chord, and so the seventh of F is going to be E. So we have an E here, which we can tie over, and then we need an F here, and then we'll move this C down to an A. So what happens is that we have that incomplete seventh chord missing the fifth, which is perfectly fine. It still has all the qualities that we need, the third and the seventh. So here's a 4-7, and let's continue moving by fourths, up fourths or down fifths. So I'll move down a fifth to 7 diminished. So the first thing we need to be aware of is the seventh resolving down properly. So this is a given that this is going to be a D. And then we need an A for the seventh, which is here. So this is also taken care of with this A being held over. And then all we're missing is an F, which we happen to have, so we can hold this note as well. And now we're going to move this up a fourth to 3. And so first of all, we need to make sure that the seventh resolves down a step. So this A moves down to G, and this is going to be a 3-7, of course. So we're going to hold the seventh of E is D. So we're going to tie over this D here, and then we're going to move this F down a step to E. So again, this is that incomplete seventh chord. And what we'll see is that this pattern of an incomplete seventh and a complete seventh is just going to repeat over and over for as long as we do this chain of up a fourth, down a fifth. So now we'll go down a fifth to A, which is 6, 7, and all the same voice leading is going to happen that happened here. So here's the seventh, moving down by step, and this is going to go down by step, and then here is the seventh of the next chord, so this G ends up being the seventh of the next chord here, and then we've got this E, which I will hold over to an E. Is that right? Yeah. So now we've got A, E, G, C. So again, a complete seventh chord with the fifth. And now let's move it up one more time. So to a D up a fourth, which means it's going to be a 2-7. And again, the exact same voice leading. So we've got the C here, which ends up being the seventh for the D. And then we need this G here, which was the seventh of the A minor chord, to resolve down. And then we'll move this E down to a D, which gives us a D minor 7 chord with no fifth. And now we can simply move to a 5-7 and then a 1 to complete the progression with a cadence. So the C needs to move down to B to resolve the seventh, and then here's the seventh of the 5, and then D here. And now we simply resolve this dominant chord in the way we've been doing. So D goes down to C, the F, the seventh, resolves to E, and then B resolves up to C. So actually we end up with a dominant chord that's 3 roots and a third, which is fine, called the triple root. So again, just to review this, we have, let's see here, we've got the incomplete seventh, and then the complete, and then the incomplete, and the complete. And this is a great progression to practice playing on the piano, moving your fingers in the same way every time. So the F, the E going down to D, and then the F and the A going down to E and G, and then the top voice moving down, and then these two notes moving down. So this is by far the most common sequence of seventh chords that we will encounter. Okay, for our first example, let's say we're given a bass line and asked to include seventh chords in our part writing. So let's say we have C moving to A, moving to F, and then a cadence from G to C. So first we can make a simple Roman numeral analysis of the bass line that makes sense harmonically. So we can move from 1 to 6 to 4 to 5 to 1. And so let's start with our 1 chord here. So what about C, E, G? And so let's think about this next chord, this A minor chord. So what is the seventh of this A minor chord? It's a G. So can we include a seventh in this chord? And it turns out, yes, we can, because we have a G in the previous chord for the preparation. So here's a G here, so we can make this an A minor 7, which means then we can simply hold the C and the E over, and we have a complete chord with the seventh. And now we need to worry about, can this seventh resolve down? And yes, it can, because the next chord is an F major chord. And then let's say we wanted to try to include another seventh. So we need to think about what the seventh is of F. It's E. So we have an E here, so we can hold it over. It makes this nice minor second with the F. So here's a seventh here. And then we need a third to this chord, so the C will move down to A. So here's an incomplete seventh chord, but we've got the third and the seventh, so that's fine. And then moving to 5, we need to make sure to resolve the seventh down to D. And let's make this a 5. Let's make this 5 a 7 as well. So we'll keep the F held over. And now we're just missing a leading tone, so we'll take this A up to B. And notice with all these seventh resolutions and 5/7 chords that the voice leading going from 4 to 5 is much smoother. We don't have to purposefully introduce tons of contrary motion just to avoid parallels now that we have a 5/7. And then finally, we just need to resolve the notes. So the leading tone has to resolve up to C, and the seventh resolves down to E, and then the D will double the root here. Okay, for our second example, let's say we're asked to do the same thing in minor. So let's practice a bass line in minor. So we can go from, let's go A, D, and then E, A. So let's see here. So we have 1, and then this could be, of course, it's a subdominant note, the 4th scale degree, so it could be either a 4 or a 2, 6. And let's say it's a 4. And then this, of course, is going to be the 5 going to 1. And the question is just asking us to introduce a seventh. So let's say we have A, C, E. And so the D minor chord means that the seventh is going to be C, so we need to hold this C over. And then this E can go down to D, and this A can go down to F. So we've got an incomplete chord here. And now we need to make sure to resolve the seventh down to B, and then move this D, let's see, up to E. Actually, we're going to need to move the D to G sharp for the 5 chord, because we can't move the F to G sharp because of the augmented interval. So, and then this F moves down to an E natural, And now we can simply resolve this by holding the E, moving the B to the C, and the leading tone G sharp up to A. Okay, for our third example, let's say we're given a bass line. Let's switch keys to G major. That looks something like this: G, D, C, B. And we're asked to harmonize this bass line. So we can look at it and think about, here's 1, and here's 5, and now 5 is followed by the 4th scale degree. And so we know that since we're coming from a dominant chord, we can't introduce a 4 or a 2-6. So remember, this is that example of the 5-4-2, which always resolves to a 1-6. So this pattern, this bass pattern, should be learned basically as a unchanging pattern for when we see it. This is how to harmonize it. And now let's do the upper voices. So we've got G, B, D, moving to a 5 chord, so we're going to keep the common tone and move the other voices as close as possible by step to F sharp and A. And then this is still a 5 chord, so we can keep the upper voices exactly where they are. And now for the final 1-6, we can move the F sharp to G and the A to G, and then keep the D on D. So again, this is that example of the inversion of 5-7, which comes from a D. It's almost like back to the lesson on non-harmonic tones. This is almost like a passing tone between 5 and 1-6. Just happens to work out to be the 7th of the chord. Okay, and for the last example, let's harmonize a group of 7ths in that sequence of rising 4ths and falling 5ths. So let's give ourselves the same bass line. So C, F, B, E, A, D, G. And let's start with a different arrangement of the upper voices. So what if we have, let's see, what about C, E, and G? So now let's provide the Roman numerals just to make it easier to think about the harmonies. So 4-7, 7 diminished 7, 3-7, 6-7, 2-7, and then 5. So of course the 7th of F major is E, so we're going to hold this E over, and now we can move this G down to F and this C down to A. And then for the next note, next chord, we need to make sure that the 7th resolves down. So the E is going to resolve down to D, while the F and the A stay on the same notes. So again, what happens is from one chord to another, we have one common tone while the other two voices move down. And then in the next chord, these two voices stay the same while the 7th resolves down. And we'll see this same pattern again as we move to the E minor 7. So here's the D, which is the 7th, so it's going to stay on D, while this F moves down to E, and this A moves down to G. And now, of course, we're going to have the same thing happen here. So we have this 7th resolving down, the D resolving down to C, while the E and the G stay on the same notes, giving us this complete 7th chord on A, C, E, G. And no surprise here, the C prepares the 7th for the D minor chord, and then the E moves down to D, and the G moves down to F, giving us an incomplete 7th chord, D minor 7th chord. And now we're going to move all this to 5. So we'll move the F up to G, the C, the 7th resolves down to B, and then the D holds over. And now we can just complete it with a cadence on 1. So G, C, E. So again, reviewing these again, we have this incomplete, 7th, incomplete, incomplete, with the same motion in the voices for each pair of chords, moving down, holding the 7th over, and then moving the 7th down. All right, thanks for visiting educator.com's AP Music Theory course. See you next time.